as drivers of disease, criminality, and unemployment, as undeserving profiteers of the welfare state. However, we also see other states trying to redefine migrants as labor capital or social capital. And in doing so, they risk turning them from forced migrants into entrance into a form of forced labor opportunities, forced labor opportunities through a combination of legal and social imperatives. Which of these is the better approach? The second point I want to make today is about our insistence on looking at migration through the prism of the individual nation state. The paradox of the nation state is that its policies carry weight since its borders are sovereign, and sovereignty is the ground definition, the basic definition of the nation state. And yet politically, the movement of people is often trans-regional or transnational. Viewing migration only through the nationalist lens often ignores regional and area-wide crises that are prolonged with a correspondingly intractable effect on displacement. And this is something that Mohammed Abu Bakr just mentioned in the previous session. Whether we look at Afghanistan or Syria, Sudan or Venezuela, we are also looking at policies of the Cold War. We are also looking at policies of NATO. We are also looking at the policies of the IMF. We are also looking at our need for energy markets and precious metals. So this is not one country's problem or even an individual need. This is a systemic issue that affects all of us, and we are all complicit in it. Displacement increasingly affects more people who remain displaced for a longer period of time. What this means is that forced migrants and migrants in general are likely to spend a longer period in transit or in formal or informal camps without being resettled. The average period people spend in refugee camps in Africa, for instance, is 16 years. Think about that for a while. This means that camps house multi-generational groups who live in a space that is not home and not abroad. It is just an endless present of waiting, as Michel Agier calls it. Longer stays in camps encourages violence within and around camps, and camp residents have poorer outcomes across all markers of human well-being. Thinking about how the spatial geographies of camps produce surveillance, biopolitical policing, and violence, ostensibly through humanitarian organizations, has produced many valuable critiques at the level of theory and anthropology about the outsourcing of care for the world's most vulnerable population. The second paradox is that camps exist within borders of the nation state as well as within the borders of the camp. So it's a double border. Thus, they suffer under a double regime of restriction, illegality, and violence through people who supposedly are supposed to be helpers and managers of these camps. This may be in the form of representative groups that bodies like the UNHCR work with, translators, aid workers, and sometimes militias and political groups. The longer people stay in camps, the more autonomous and permanent camps become, and the higher the risk of physical and mental and political violence. So in what follows, after having laid out what I see as some of the big problems, what I would like to do is pose a few questions and then try to answer some of these questions in the form of suggestions or, possible solutions. The first question I'm asking is, do we see migrants as human capital or as a burden? Listening to the vice presidential debate on Tuesday night, despite my best intentions, it became clear to me that immigration, especially in the form of fear, about illegal migration was the single most emotive topic pushing Republicans' campaign. One of the quotes that J.D. Vance, one of the sentences that he kept saying was 25 million illegal aliens competing with Americans for scarce homes is one of the most significant drivers of home prices in the country. Though this claim has very little data to back it up. Alternatively, they were driving up crime or driving up gun ownership or driving up drugs in the US. When I look instead at organizations like the Migration Policy Institute or even the Department of Homeland Security, it becomes clear that the state of forced migration is much more complicated and it evolves over time. Migration is the source of valuable contributions to the economy, to society, even as it keeps being defined as a problem. So who are the people coming to the US? A prime mover of migration is poverty and political conditions such as war or civil war in the host countries. War, which is also linked to poverty and political conditions, and also the presence in these countries of other armies, other corporations. So these people coming to the US are coming here whether or not they have legal access or legal means to come to the US. And this changes over time. So one of the biggest sending countries to the US for years was Mexico. And if you look at the data in the last decade, as employment opportunities within Mexico have increased, their numbers have fallen. Now, instead of Mexico, we are seeing higher rates coming to the US from Central America and Venezuela. Are these people a burden on the US? Employment data from the National Immigration Law Center, NILC, shows us that immigrants are actually projected to contribute $7 trillion to the economy of the United States over the next 10 years. In 2019 alone, immigrants contributed $5.8 billion in taxes, including to Social Security and Medicare. So if grandma or grandpa or uncle are right now drawing on Social Security or have Medicare, you actually have immigrants to thank. So are they a burden? If instead we turn to unemployment rates in the US, apart from a big increase in unemployment during the 2019-2020 years because of COVID, they currently are at a historic low of 4%. Below 4%, it becomes actually a problem for our economy. This means that industries and employers need more, not less workers. In many states in the US, businesses are unable to function because they don't have workers. So the argument that migrants are competing with US citizens or imposing a burden on the economy are just not borne out by facts. We are instead getting, in the form of migrants, a working age population that we have not spent a dime in educating and are ready to enter the workforce. We pay very little in healthcare for them because they come to us as young adults. For a moment, if we switch from looking at the United States to looking at Germany, I want to explore another example. In Germany in 2015, Angela Merkel decided to open its borders to asylum seekers from 3 countries, Syria, Afghanistan, and Sudan, making a calculated gamble that the demographic decline in Germany would be aided by working-age migrants. These migrants would keep the welfare state in a healthy condition. To insert them quickly into the labor force, the German state mandated compulsory language and culture courses, compulsory physical distribution across across German states for the first few years. And if they followed the rules, ultimately, these migrants would be allowed to apply for citizenship. Alexander Betts and Paul Collier, in their book called Refuge, Transforming a Broken Refugee System, point out that the right to refuge is a qualified right. and migrants have to make a contribution to the economy. This position, by the way, is fairly controversial, and not all scholars of refugee studies are willing to go along with it. But this is one of their major suggestions for solving the so-called broken state of the system as it exists right now. However, my question is, can we have a system that seeks to see refugees as a potential economic resource? What are the pros and cons of it? Does this contravene the humanitarian basis of refugee law? Betts and Collier say no, the right to refuge comes hedged around with many limitations. In Germany, the Merkel experiment worked to gain consent from German citizens by making the argument that her decision was a long-term investment in Germany's future. Germany was a country in demographic decline. It needed workers in order to sustain its welfare model. Migrants were work-ready and could pay into the welfare system. It was a good argument, one that many Germans enthusiastically accepted. And so far, as Mohammed Abu Bakr said a while ago, data seem to bear this out. Most of the 2015 migrants are working, they are enrolled in language classes, they are tracked, they are measured, and they are pushed to contribute. While fair, though, it's not a long-term solution. People who are fleeing for the traditional reasons of fear of persecution, as in the case of Syria, also have vulnerabilities and needs, including medical needs, psychological needs, educational needs, and humanitarian needs. So if we admit them on the basis that they're going to be good workers, and then we find out that they are also vulnerable and they also need to lean on the state and get support from the state for needs that they might have for various reasons, it wouldn't be fair to turn around and then say, the premise on which we admitted you was that you would work. Thus, the German model, while seeming really admirable and working for Germany, might not be an easy model to replicate. There are two additional dangers to this model. One danger that I see is that the basis for the nation state is ethnic and religious homogeneity, even if it is perceived. Using migration in this way might provide an economic fix, but it doesn't address the fear of ethnic, racial, and religious mixing and the paranoia that it creates. In Germany, Austria, and the United Kingdom, we see the rise of extreme right-wing parties like the AfD, the Freedom Party in Austria, the Reform UK Party in the United Kingdom. And even though as of now they haven't won a majority at the national level, their agenda of xenophobia and anti-immigrant policies has become very influential and has moved more towards the center of the governing party. Is there a way that states can address these fears under this economic model? Secondly, at some point, if instrumental reason starts determining which populations can contribute to the economy and which populations can't, won't nation states start picking and choosing which refugee populations they will admit and which they will keep out? Are Syrians better educated than the Sudanese? Will the Chinese fit in better than the Filipinos? And when we do that, will Islamophobia be far behind? Soon we might ask, do refugees meet an education or skill requirement? Can they have political rights, or are they just workers? These questions go to the heart of what it is and what it means to follow humanitarian law. The very basis of refugee protection are that these, populations are not seen purely as an economic resource. Nevertheless, the economic argument is an important one, and it can help with gaining more acceptance for migration, but it can't be the only criterion we use to justify migration. If we do that, we are on a slippery slope towards discrimination. And for that reason alone, I think it shouldn't be one that we should rely on. Sure, integration and acculturation are important, but integration also means that the countries that receive migrants have to learn about the culture and conventions of incoming migrants. It's not a one-way street. And yes, this will change German or Swedish or French or Austrian or American culture. But culture has never been a static identity. After all, German culture, as we see it now, didn't exist because Germany didn't exist before 1864. So if it changes, if German culture changes 150 years later, it's not a disaster. It has changed before. And that's why it's an invented tradition. When the AfD says on its platform that it wants to preserve German culture, language, and identity, and see German as a predominant culture instead of multiculturalism, I wonder which specific culture they're talking about. Is it the one that existed in 1950, or the 1990s, or the 1890s, or the 1940s? While appealing to history, the arguments that right-wing parties make are actually pretty ahistorical and selective. Moving to my second point about states and sovereignty, I want to talk about the paradox about the nation-state's concept of sovereignty, to which the control of borders is pretty basic and integral, and the fact that population flows have historically never respected formal borders. Even in recent history, if you look at Afghanistan's refugees and their links to Iran and Pakistan, or the ways in which Palestinians have historical and modern links to Jordan and to Lebanon, it's clear that borders and cultures are not absolute, even though states insist on this being a precondition of their sovereignty. People have always moved. The modern nation state forms the basis of international law, and borders are fundamental to understanding the concept of territorial sovereignty. However challenged, the nation state, though, has never been the only entity with these powers of controlling population and controlling borders. Displaced populations, whether they are internally displaced or displaced across state borders, have always found themselves subject to multiple regimes of power. Some state-linked, some non-state actors, and others which are neither state-linked nor non-state but occupy a qualified kind of legitimacy, which in many cases is linked to the phenomena of large-scale displacement. An example of this can be seen by looking at the Palestinian refugee population in Lebanon or the Afghan refugee population in Pakistan. The work of Adam Ramadan and Sarah Fragonesi at the University of Birmingham has shown us, through looking at the political geography of Palestinians in Lebanon, that multiple non-state actors like militias, welfare actors, political organizations like the PLO, like the Hezbollah, religious organizations affiliated to different sects, welfare societies, have all acted on refugee populations. They have spoken for them, they have also surveilled them and controlled them, they have mobilized them, they have deployed them in pursuit of political agendas, all in ways that have worked at cross purposes often, and sometimes in collaboration with the Lebanese state. Nonprofits and international NGOs and states have worked with these actors with varying degrees of success, and sometimes not to the benefit of refugees. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, which is now in power, was one of these non-state actors, supported by the government and armies of the US and of Pakistan. As we speak, the EU has also employed non-state actors in controlling its borders. The EU has outsourced the work of preventing migrants from crossing the Mediterranean to militias in Libya and Tunisia, and also to quasi-private transnational entity that they control called Frontex. Frontex has its own armies and arms that they deploy to seek and essentially turn back migrants. The level of violence against potential migrants, not actual migrants, not just people who cross borders, but people before they cross borders, because it is carried out by non-state actors, is carried out with impunity, because migrants have a high degree of vulnerability and no recourse to legal courts or protection. If non-state and transnational actors can control and push back migration, there is a stronger argument, I think, to using larger non-state actors to deploy to address the needs of people who cross international borders. And that is sort of, what I'm trying to say, in keeping with the theme of this conference. I will now turn to, possible ideas and solutions for these paradoxes of sovereignty and these paradoxes of defining migrants as economic resources or objects of our charity. One solution would be to allow non-state actors to manage and set policy. Coming back to North America, thinking, for instance, that US and Canada have actually historically depended on the Mexican state to control and push back migrants crossing the border. It's a fluke of geography. There is really, our borders are pretty well protected on two sides by the ocean. Canada is protected by the US, and the US by Canada on its northern border. Instead of this unequal distribution of policing, why not create a North American entity that will process and direct migrants across the three countries? The EU tried to implement a punitive version of this through its Dublin Declarations 1, 2, and 3, which mandated that the first countries where migrants enter and register for asylum would be responsible for them. The Dublin Declarations basically have pushed back the EU borders to its southern shores and eastern borders. And what it has done is it's protected the richer northern countries and burdened the southern poorer border states like Greece and Italy. But what if we were to create a version of this which would be able to distribute the work of adjudicating asylum cases and hosting migrants in an equitable way across Mexico, the US, and Canada? A body that would be staffed by all three countries with an agreed upon consultative set of criteria by which to hear cases, and a way to make sure that the needs of all three countries and the needs of asylum seekers could be addressed in a fair and meaningful way. The Organization of African Unity tried to do something like this in the 1980s, but they didn't go far enough. A model of this kind of distribution actually exists in Germany internally. It's called the Königstein Key. And the Königstein Key, and tomorrow I hope some of our speakers on the German panel will be able to speak more to its success or not. It's an algorithm which works with different German states to assess economic ability, economic needs, population needs, labor needs, and housing infrastructure, available housing infrastructure, among other things, in order to allocate incoming migrants to them. So it decides every year how many migrants go to different states within Germany. This addresses both specific requirements and the changing requirements of different areas with a country-wide openness, along with a country-wide openness to migration. Angela Merkel had actually asked the EU to come up with a version of this for the EU after 2015, but politically the idea went nowhere. So I think what this suggests to me is that this could work at a transnational level, and address this question of who bears the so-called burden of migration. So that is one idea that I want to throw out there. The second idea is to really increase temporary labor migration. One of the post-Cold War developments has been, on the one hand, there's a widening economic gulf between lower income countries and the global north. And this is partly behind the political fear of migration and the rise of right-wing parties. Allowing migrants to come and work, while at the same time bumping up remittances, might be one way to address this economic inequality. Historically, European countries and the EU look to the past when they tried temporary labor migration from 1950s to 1973 as a lesson to not encourage labor migration. But I think it's time to revisit the idea. If borders were more open instead of more restrictive, the desperation of people willing to die on rickety boat crossings, might be managed a little bit better. Added to that, the skills transfer and the increased opportunities this would bring would actually result in more stability to Central American countries and to African and Middle Eastern migrants. We already have a model of this again in the form of free labor flows within the EU. So when the EU comes into being with the Maastricht Treaty, just to choose one date among many, the premise of the EU was that internal borders would not be policed, that people would be free to go where there were jobs, they could settle down anywhere in the EU, and that the free market essentially would decide where people went. At that time, it was a radical idea, but now we have, 25 years where we have seen how it works, and with the exception of Brexit, it's worked pretty well. So it's a counterintuitive idea, instead of raising borders, actually lower them and let people come and work based on where jobs are available. A third suggestion is to dismantle, find a way of dismantling trafficking agents and human smuggling organizations that aid dangerous sea and land crossings. And this is linked to the previous idea about actually lowering borders. The more we try to restrict migration by tightening security and activating sea and land pushbacks and externalizing the work of addressing migration flows like Frontex and so on, the larger the profit motive there is for trafficking militias to thrive. Following on that, I have two more things that I want to say. One is borders are not the be-all and end-all of migration. A huge question is, what do we do when people come to our country? So we have to provide better infrastructure for migrants to succeed. Depending on the areas, this might be language training, job orientation, professional networking, opportunities for professional networking. It might, at the other end of the spectrum, also include better policing to ensure that people return at the end of their labor contracts. Probably this won't be a popular idea, but for the system to remain open, it might be something that has to be implemented. Right now, the US in particular has a very hands-off, fragmented approach to helping people who arrive in this country. That would have to change to a more ongoing investment in skills development, housing, and employment training. Lastly, migrants use existing networks to settle into countries and to develop success. They also travel along pathways that already exist. So existing networks within countries, which include diaspora groups, diaspora populations, diaspora organizations, who have tangible and intangible resources, can act as everyday diplomats and help the state in integrating and acculturating new migrants. Just as migrants are not a problem, nobody alone is a solution. In conclusion, then, I think I just want to sum up and say it's been very clear that since the end of the Cold War, the number of people fleeing poverty-related violence, political breakdown, and region-wide wars has been increasing. The UNHCR says that in 2024, there are right now 117 million people who are displaced, of which around 46 million are refugees. 3/4 of this number, about 75%, are hosted by low and middle income countries. Despite the rhetoric from the global north, the true burden is borne by countries like Lebanon, Turkey, Pakistan, and Iran. This is both unfair and unequal. Region-wide wars in the Middle East and North Africa are also the responsibility of the US and EU's foreign policies and politics. Historically, many of these wars and much of this instability can trace its roots to colonial policies as well. The global north can't define this issue as a problem of unequal development or economic opportunism. In the UK in the 1970s, and this was something that I studied for a previous book project, many Caribbean and South Asian people who were organizing for fairer labor laws and anti-racist policing had a slogan. It said, "We are here because you were there." That slogan applies even more when we look at how migration is being managed currently. They are here because we were there. Morally and politically, countries in the North have to answer globally to problems that they have created. Thank you very much for your patience. And that is the end of my talk, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Aja, thank you so very much for such a comprehensive and broad overview of some of the meta questions. And I really appreciated so many of your suggestions for how one might approach some of these ostensibly intractable problems. And I think that you really placed into conversation a number of your proposals with some of our previous panelists today have already mentioned. So I think that's like one of the most wonderful things that can happen, I think, in any conference.